start the recording.
Once again, friends, fellow learners, it's a delight to be able to share this space with you, to embark on this journey of learning and cultural and spiritual development. On behalf of the Rhinebeck Reformed Church and the Jewish Federation of Dutchess County, we welcome you, including Dr. Chilton, our academic and intellectual and religious mentor, and Karen Hockhauser, our wonderful and dynamic and education partner. All these efforts that we put forth to help us come together as community. I'm holding this book. If you have not had a chance to buy it, please purchase it, because learning is a cycle. And we have studied very carefully the Dynasty of the Herods. Today we conclude that lecture series, but not our commitment to study together. In the fall, Karen, your humble servant, Dr. Chilton, will share a programmatic idea or concept. Most likely, we're going to be looking at the Judeo-Christian ethic on immigration, especially with all the refugees involving Afghanistan and Ukraine and south of the border, which continues to be a polemical issue, and the divisiveness it's creating in this country, how our faiths can inform us to create sensible policies and to embrace the stranger and deal with xenophobia and other issues that go with that. Dr. Chilton doesn't need an elaborate introduction. We know he is a world-class scholar, teaches at Bard College, a purveyor of many classical academic books. So it's a privilege and honor to defer this platform to him. We got a little sample of his brilliance earlier as he was talking to us of the underpinnings of Christianity. And if you didn't get a chance to hear it, I hope that it's recorded, right, Karen?
He's going to repeat that part for us since we didn't get that part on the recording.
They're doubling down. They're making you work twice. So that's wonderful. So without no further ado, Dr. Chilton, the floor is all yours, sir.
Thanks very much, Luis.
Yes.
I appreciate that very much. And I'll certainly honor this request to repeat our little discussion about the term Christianos, Christian, but I'll do that later on in the presentation when it actually comes up through the work of the person we're really focusing on, whom I must say I have found to be the most interesting of all the Herodians, namely Bereniké. I like to use the Greek form of her name because Bereniké in Greek means bearer of victory. So she very much represents the aspirations of the Herodian dynasty. And what we'll see during the course of discussion is that she fulfills these aspirations to a remarkable extent and also exerts a powerful influence at key points on Judaism, on Christianity, and on the Roman Empire as a whole. She is a remarkable person, all the more so since, as we'll also see, she grew up and exercised her influence during a period that was remarkably misogynist. The kind of abuse directed at her because she was a woman was equaled only by the abuse directed at her because she was a Jew. So we're also going to see her negotiation of those issues and the question of ancient anti-Semitism, which in my opinion has a great deal to teach us about the nature of anti-Semitism at the moment. So those in the room will see the handout, and let me just see if I can share the screen to put the handout forward for those who are on what I might call the West Coast. I hope you can see that now. And as you see, we begin in the year 38. Excuse me, did someone have a comment or question? All right, okay. We begin in the year 38 of the Common Era, and Bereniké is 10 years old. And yes, that's not a misprint. Her father marries her off at the age of 10. What causes this? Her father is someone we dealt with last time, namely Agrippa the First, the most successful of all the Herods after Herod the Great himself. Agrippa the First is the grandson of Herod the Great. You remember he was a great friend of Caligula. Because Caligula elevated him and said that he could go out and become king of part of the lands of his grandfather, Agrippa the First decided, okay, since I'm going to be named king, I'm going to fit myself out in appropriate attire, have a diadem on my head, and I'm going to make a stately progress towards my lands by going through Alexandria. And he goes through Alexandria because there is in Alexandria a very wealthy person named Marcus Julius Alexander. Now, you may recall that Agrippa the First had a chronic problem with money. He was constantly in debt. Caligula, when Caligula made him king, gave him a golden chain, right? This chain was equal in weight to the chain that had bound Agrippa when he'd been put in jail by the previous emperor, Tiberius. Because you remember, old Agrippa just loved Caligula, and he said one day to Caligula, while Tiberius was still alive, wouldn't it be great if Tiberius died and you became emperor? Unfortunately, the driver of the chariot reported that to the Emperor Tiberius, who was not happy. So he's put in chains, but it all comes right when in fact, Caligula becomes emperor. So Agrippa the First is using everything at his disposal to get what he now wants, including his 10-year-old daughter, who he marries off to Marcus Julius Alexander, who is very wealthy. Because now Agrippa the First can raise loans. So she is sexualized before puberty, right? Used by her father, and you can imagine what this does to her reputation over time. Our next step, we move from Caligula to the following emperor, Claudius. Agrippa the First also made himself useful to the new emperor, Claudius, and so he advances. He gets more lands. He gets all the lands that had been ruled by Herod the Great, and he remembers his brother. The brother of Agrippa the First, his name, I'm sorry, Herod. He's known as Herod, king of Chalcis, because he's given the territory of Chalcis, which is to the north of Galilee. It's a small territory, but Herod, king of Chalcis, is a king. And at this time, in the year 42, Marcus Julius Alexander had died. And so Bereniké is available again. Agrippa the First is not going to let that particular marker be isolated on the table. And so he marries her off again to his own brother, to Herod, king of Chalcis, which of course is against the Torah, right? It's against the law of marriages in the book of Leviticus to do anything approaching this. I said she was sexualized by her father, and sure enough, she is. Why is this happening? Because this kind of marriage, which from our point of view is incestuous, and is incestuous from the point of view of the book of Leviticus, this kind of marriage is fashionable in the Roman Empire. Because the thought is that you concentrate power within bloodlines by doing this. So she marries Herod, king of Chalcis, and becomes, therefore, Queen Bereniké. And she comes to be called Queen Bereniké for the whole of her life. Never ceases to be a queen, even after the death, which we're coming up to, of Herod, king of Chalcis. She has children. Interestingly, she names one of her sons Berenikianus. Berenike, the masculine form, Berenikianus. The young kid is named Bearer of Victory. And she names another son Hyrcanus. Hyrcanus, one of those Maccabean names that she has a right to because she is derived from a marriage between Herod the Great and Mariamne. So she combines royal blood and Maccabean high priestly blood. She has every reason to believe she has room for maneuver, and she has exactly that. Well, despite this relatively prosperous marriage to Herod, king of Chalcis, she then has to confront this remarkable blow to the entire dynasty. You recall that Agrippa I, at the age of only 54, young age for a Herodian, tended to be a pretty robust lot, dies very suddenly. And the disaster for Bereniké is not only the death of her father, and therefore the fact that they lose the great combined throne of the Herodians, but that there are local demonstrations against the whole Herodian dynasty in a place called Sebaste in particular. Sebaste was a major city in Samaria, and these demonstrations, as elsewhere in the area, were against Agrippa I. The idea was it's a good thing that he died. There were actually parties held congratulating the ferrymen across the river Styx for getting Agrippa I and sending him away. Part of the antipathy towards Agrippa I was that he was behaving too much like a Hellenistic monarch. And likewise, that his daughter Bereniké is behaving as if she were a queen among the Romans and not among Judea. So a consequence of that is that Agrippa I, part of his vanity was he liked putting up statues to members of his family. So he put up a statue of Bereniké. The statue was raped in effigy by the rioters. I mean, this is the most vile kind of personal attack which is imaginable. So it gives us a very clear idea of the difficulty that Bereniké is in. It also enables us to understand something that I referred to last time, namely that Claudius, the emperor of the time, although very much in favor of the Herodian dynasty, decides not to elevate Agrippa II, the son of Agrippa I, decides not to elevate him to become the replacement to be king of this whole area. Instead, we're back to a procurator in Judea, and the imperial policy is to try Agrippa II out.
Yeah, thank you.
Various posts to see whether he can be elevated into power. But one of those procurators is, and here you'll see under the years 46 to 48, a name that seems familiar perhaps. It is namely Tiberius Alexander. He turns out to be the brother of Marcus Julius Alexander, the previous husband of Bereniké. Guess what? He comes in to be procurator of Judea. So even when Bereniké is not in power, Agrippa II is not in power, they can have their influence. They can nurture their ambitions. what follows that during the close of this period is the death of her husband, Herod, king of Chalkis. And instead now of putting Chalkis under Roman rule, the emperor brings Agrippa II in to become the new king of Chalkis, and he's with his sister, Bereniké, who maintains the title of queen. This introduces a problem, a life problem, which we'll see coming up again and again. Namely, Bereniké has this history, which was forced on her by her father, of marriages that are convenient for Agrippa I.
I don't get they just leave them outside, I'll pick them up.
And the consequence of that is that she has a reputation for sexual license, right? Rather typical. Women are forced into marriages, then they're accused of being promiscuous. Even modern historians have referred to Bereniké as the little Cleopatra, as if she were like the snake of the Nile, whereas in fact, her position was really quite different. What compounds this is that when Agrippa II comes to Chalkis and lives, then Bereniké is residing with Agrippa II, her brother, and he does not marry. Guess what the rumor was, right? So they are commonly accused of incest as a result of that. During the 50s, Bereniké tries to get around this. You see, in the year 53, tries to get around this by marrying the king of Cilicia, Polemo. Unfortunately, that marriage didn't work. She moved back in with Agrippa II. So that only reinforced the rumor. Now, I want to explain how widespread this rumor was. It wasn't only whisperings among people who wanted her to keep the laws of Leviticus more closely. It was a matter of public scandal in the Roman Empire. And the nature of this scandal tells us something about the nature of misogyny and the nature of anti-Semitism in the empire. And it comes to us through none other than the famous Latin satirist whose name was Juvenal. Juvenal wrote in the time, several decades after these events, but what he shows us is that these events were still fresh in people's minds who were not living anywhere near Judea, very, very far from the original events. The particular satire that Juvenal is writing is one in which he explains why you should never, ever get married. You know, why marriage is a poor idea. And guess what? Marriage is a poor idea because women are unreliable. Now, let's see what he does with that particular trope. Speaking of what will happen if you are so rash as to marry a woman, he writes, she will carry off crystal vases. She's going to take all your property. She will carry off crystal vases, the most enormous pieces of agate, plus a legendary diamond made more precious by Bereniké's finger. So the image of someone who is pillaging your wealth is someone who would manage to get a ring that had belonged to Bereniké. This is decades after the event. But apparently, as readers in Rome, we're supposed to remember this. And Juvenal goes on. He says, the barbarian Agrippa, isn't that, you see how this works? A Jew is a barbarian. He's not one of us. The barbarian Agrippa gave it to his incestuous sister to wear. That's rich, isn't it? The Romans are accusing the Jews of being incestuous, given the kind of marriages Romans themselves contract. The barbarian Agrippa gave it to his incestuous sister to wear, where barefoot kings observe Sabbaths as feasts, and custom grants clemency to old pigs. So you have the picture. Jews are not us because they're incestuous, because they're led around the nose by women, because they're lazy, they don't work on the Sabbath, and they don't even know how to eat pig. Anti-Semitism is a major ancient trope. It's why we were saying in a short discussion before we began today that it is folly to try to explain anti-Semitism as the fault of one particular culture. It is not because the Germans were worse than others in Europe. Other nations of Europe did what the Germans did, only before modern Germany. It is fallacy to think of it as associated only with the reaction of Islam or only with the reaction of Christianity. It's the reaction of larger cultures to minority cultures. And because Judaic identity is consistent over time, these various cultures have reacted in this way. The ancient world can teach us a great deal about the nature of the modern world in this regard, as well as several others. So now Bereniké has got this reputation hung about her. And it's very interesting that if we get now to the year 59, Bereniké is portrayed in the book of Acts, and we saw this scene itself last time. She's portrayed in the book of Acts as sitting down with her brother, Agrippa II, and the procurator of the time, the Roman procurator, whose name was Festus. And Bereniké, together with Agrippa II, adjudicates the case of Paul the Apostle. He had been arrested within the temple, as we saw. The question was, should he, as someone who was a Jew by birth, should he be arrested? Should he be charged with a crime because he entered into the temple? And both Bereniké and Agrippa II decide really, no, he should really be released. That's their advice to Festus. And Festus, in fact, only decides to send Paul on to Rome, not because he charges him with anything, but because Paul has already appealed to Rome in order to adjudicate the case. So what is Bereniké deciding? This gets back to an issue that we were discussing at the very beginning before we actually turned to Bereniké, namely, what is in this term Christian? Because the interview between Paul, Agrippa II, and Bereniké is one of the few places where in the New Testament itself, the term Christianos is used. And in this setting, the remark is made to Paul, Paul, if you go on talking, you're close to making me into a Christianos. Why is this stated with irony? The reason for that is, as the book of Acts also shows, the term Christian is invented as a term of contempt. In the 40s, in Antioch, the people of that city in Syria could see very well that there were followers of Jesus who were themselves not within the practice of Judaism. There were non-Jewish people who were baptized. That seemed an oddity. By the 2nd century, it wasn't odd, right? By the 2nd century, most of those baptized came from among those who were not Jews. But in the 1st century, certainly all the leaders within this nascent movement were themselves Jews, and most of the adherents were too. But in a Gentile city such as Antioch, which was the 3rd largest city in the ancient world, went to Rome, Alexandria, Antioch was number 3. The people of Antioch could see, well, this is strange. We have a Jewish teacher called a rabbi who was killed by the Romans, who was being worshipped by non-Jews. What shall we call these people? And so they invented a term. Those who worshiped Jesus respected him as being the anointed, the Christos, the Christ. And so we'll call these people the equivalent of Christ groupies. Because in the Greek language, when you added to the and, ianos, it was the equivalent in English, in many cases, of adding ite. So people who followed Bill Clinton were often called Clintonites, right? In Britain, people who followed Margaret Thatcher were called Thatcherites. It's a way of referring to someone as being a political partisan. And that was applied in Greek. And so basically, Christianos is the equivalent of saying Christite. It's deliberately dismissive, which explains why this is an ironic statement. If you keep talking, you'll make me into a Christite. This is hysterically funny, they think. Over the years, when Christians come to be persecuted, they often have to face the question by magistrates, are you refusing to offer sacrifice to the emperor because you're a Christite? Well, you know what? Sometimes you might just be angry enough to say, yes, I'm a Christite. Do what you will. So Christians came to appropriate this name under that dynamic of Roman persecution. But we can interestingly see that in the case of Bereniké, she takes the position with her brother, Agrippa II, that in fact, those who follow Jesus from Judaism, like Paul, are innocent. The Roman government has no interest in such people. Now, Bereniké is not facing the question, doesn't face the question, well, what would you do with a Gentile? She doesn't have to deal with that question. She's a Jewish queen, right? She is the person who is concerned for her Jewish population with their rights, and she is trying to guard those. We'll see that her concern for Jewish rights results in remarkable heroism. And in fact, this happens in the years immediately follow the interview with Festus, which she has together with her brother. These are in the years between 64 and 66. These are among the most fraught years of the 1st century, and indeed they're amongst the most fraught years in the history of Judaism, because these are the years that lead up to the Roman destruction of the temple in the year 70. We are in the midst now of increasing violence in and around Jerusalem in response to the Roman occupation. And tragically, we're also dealing with a period in which the Romans, in their attempt to put down what they fear, use violence in such a way that they guarantee rebellion. they try to hire groups of thugs, organized gangs, in order to make their will enforced within Jerusalem. The result of that is a breakdown of order over a number of years. In the years 64 to 66, Bereniké herself goes to Jerusalem, goes to the temple, and interestingly, she does what the Apostle Paul had once done. She offers the completion of the Nazirite vow. Something important to understand about the Nazirite vow is it was not limited to men. Women could also offer a Nazirite vow. And like any Nazirite, a woman would, during the period of the vow, maintain complete purity, that is, would not touch anything unclean, would not have any care for a dead body, even of a relative, would not drink at all. The idea was if you didn't drink, then you could be more aware of what was pure and what was impure. And during this period, you would also not cut your hair, on the understanding that then your hair, like your body, became pure. And at the close of the period of the Nazirite vow, you would then shave off all that hair, beard too, if you happen to be a male. You would shave off all of that hair and offer the hair on the altar of burnt sacrifice. It's a remarkable ritual, which involves a personal dedication by anyone who's engaged in the Nazirite vow. Bereniké does that personally in Jerusalem during the height of the violence, and after the vow, she goes before the Roman procurator, Gessius Florus, kneels, and asks him to change his policy. It's the last attempt to alter the Roman attitude towards Jerusalem and bring about peace and avert the war that was to come. Alas, Gessius Florus was one of the most violent of all the procurators. And in fact, his troops deliberately killed people in front of Bereniké. She survived, but from that moment, there was no reasonable hope of averting a revolt against the Romans and therefore the incursion of the Roman Empire in order to retake Judea, which is exactly what happens. After this failure, when in Jerusalem, the manager of the temple made a proclamation, the Romans understood that they had to intervene. That proclamation was, the Sagan of the temple, whose name was Eleazar, said, "We in the temple will not accept any gift, any sacrifice from a non-Jew." Now, Rome's settlement with Judaism had been, as I've mentioned before, that every day, twice a day, the emperor would arrange for the offering in the temple on behalf of the emperor in the morning and in the evening. Now, obviously the emperor didn't go in. No Roman soldier went in. They just provided the animal sacrifice. But now the Sagan of the temple is saying, your sacrifice is not acceptable. When that happened, the Roman Senate understood this was a declaration of their complete rejection of Roman power. And they sent in the 10th Legion Fretensis, headed up by one of the most imposing generals of the time, whose name was Vespasian. Vespasian came in And as you see, comes, this is in the year 67, comes with his son, Vespasian's son, Titus. Bereniké and Titus meet. She proves to be extremely helpful to Vespasian because remember her former in-law, Tiberius Alexander, he is now prefect of Egypt. So he supports Vespasian. Ultimately, Vespasian is going to become emperor. As a result, Titus, Vespasian's son, takes over the siege of Jerusalem. Bereniké and Titus fall in love. How deeply in love we're about to see. And now this becomes the new prospect, not only for the Herodian dynasty, this becomes a new prospect for Jerusalem. Because if she can influence Titus within this new imperial family, because Vespasian is emperor, the destruction of the temple may not be the last word. We might be able to rebuild this thing. Right? We've done it before. The temple of Herod the Great is called the Second Temple for a reason. The Temple of Solomon had long ago been destroyed in 586 BCE. It was rededicated in that century and then built up again by Herod. Yes, it's a catastrophe. So maybe in the year 71, when there's a large procession for Titus in Rome, there's a beautiful triumphal arch that was erected for him, which in fact is the only depiction there is of various implements inside the temple, because they had been paraded through Rome, part of their triumph. But there is still hope. And a historian of this time I've referred to before, named Josephus, actually writes about the chance that there could be a restoration. Why is there that chance? Bereniké is in Rome with Titus in the year 75. And in that year, she lives in the imperial residence with Titus. Roman historians of that period and later say she was living there as his wife. She takes on so much power that she starts to adjudicate court cases. You know, just as she did with her brother Agrippa II, she starts not only to sit with Titus, her husband, but sometimes to be on her own. The famous Latin grammarist, whose name was Quintilian, reports that he once argued a case in front of Bereniké. But this drives some people crazy, right? And therefore there are rumors against Bereniké, and Titus begins to fear that if he continues to have Bereniké in Rome, he will not accede to the throne after his father. So she goes back to her brother, Agrippa II, for a number of years until 79, when Vespasian dies of old age. Titus takes the place of Vespasian, and Titus is a remarkably vigorous emperor. He has to deal with the eruption of Vesuvius. By the way, an eruption in which the sister of Bereniké died with her child. It's amazing how deeply embedded this family is in the great events of the Roman Empire. He has to deal with the eruption of Vesuvius. It is Titus who completes the construction of the Colosseum. So if you go to Rome and you visit the Colosseum, which I urge you to do, this is Titus' work. And because he's emperor now, back Bereniké comes. to Rome. Do you realize how close, how very close Judaism becomes to becoming not only a legal religion, it comes close to becoming an official religion of the Roman Empire. What stopped it? Titus died of the equivalent of flu. He had been out in one of his many dedications. He wasn't in battle. He wasn't wounded. He simply caught an infection and died very suddenly. So his brother, Domitian, not one of the best emperors that ever served the empire, Domitian comes to power instead of him, and Domitian's entire religious policy is very different. Domitian wants a policy of dedication to the Roman gods alone. And so this opening that Bereniké represented was eclipsed. But it's well worth thinking about that the Roman Empire almost came officially to recognize a monotheist religion centuries before Constantine recognized Christianity. And perhaps coming that close also represented something of a precedent that could be followed later on. But with that, the Herodian dynasty makes its last play for power. But its last play is actually for a play for power on the most universal scope it had ever attempted. So thank you for joining me in discussing this very interesting person. Yes, please.
What happens to Bereniké after that? And where will she die? Where is she buried?
Excellent. That's very good. The question comes up. You see, I am repeating the question, so I'm being a good student here. A question comes up: what happens to Bereniké after the death of Titus? Agrippa II, her brother, still maintains his power. He had inherited the old city of Caesarea Philippi, which had been established by the brother of Antipas, Philip, as a major center of Herodian power. Agrippa II, unlike Bereniké, it seems basically to have lacked ambition. I mean, he was quite happy to have that position, and it became a sinecure. He basically ran it as a client of Rome, more than as a Judaic ruler. But that meant that she had a safe place to go, at least, but she had no prospect of power after that time. What becomes interesting is that you can see the disappointments about her represented in this historian Josephus, because Josephus, writing about her around the year 75, that is after the destruction of the temple, but when there's still hope we could rebuild this thing, writes very glowingly about her and about her brother, Agrippa II. But then Josephus writes another book called The Antiquities of the Jews, and he writes that in the 90s. And then he starts making cracks about her incest. So what you can see going on is that Josephus can see this is not going to happen with the temple, certainly not through Bereniké. And now I had better trim my position and represent more the line of this Hellenistic propaganda against Bereniké and against Agrippa II. But as far as we can see, she simply dies there. Where she's buried is just unknown. That is just, remember, there is yet another revolt, right? We had the revolt of 66 to 70, which was enormously destructive, resulting in the complete demolition of the temple in the year 70. There were still some holdouts, for example, at Masada. Masada was not taken until the year 73. Imagine, they held out for 3 years after defeat. Then there's another revolt against Rome that breaks out in the year 132. It lasts for 3 years. And at the close of that revolt, Rome made no mistake. They totally occupied this land. They demolished Jerusalem. They refused to allow Jews to live in Jerusalem. And they also put in a very elaborate road network throughout the area of Galilee and Judea in order to be able to patrol their holding. They wanted strategically to control this land so that they could deal with any threat that might come from the east. They saw this as being an important military pivot. And that's why they had favored the Herodians, right? They had seen the Herodians as their allies. And as long as the Herodians could deliver, the Romans were happy with that alliance. But when it became clear to the Romans that in fact they faced from the Judeans only resistance, then they decided to clamp down. So I'm afraid that destruction meant that there's a great deal that we don't know about the very end of the Herods. It's a shame that it's a whimper rather than a bang. Yes, please.
Is it a myth or is it reality from your study? It's been said that the Romans sowed salt into the fields around Judea.
This is the question about the Romans salting fields with salt. They did that, but in the case of Carthage, that was their response to Carthage, because they wished completely to destroy Carthage as a civilization.
So it's not in the area that's now Israel?
No, it is not. No, Carthage is in North Africa, and this was also at an earlier period. The Romans, as a part of their taking over this entire area of, I'll call it Greater Judea. That means Judea proper plus Galilee plus the Golan Heights. They wanted that to be productive because it was a good source of taxation and because you're dealing with very, very good, high quality agricultural produce. They want that out of Galilee. And it's difficult to get out of Judea because the soil quality in Judea is not as good. Galilee is really great. So it would not have been in the Roman interest to undermine economically what's going on in this territory. The Romans, by the imperial period, are ruthless, but they're also pragmatic. They want to increase their wealth as well as their power.
The concept of a sanctuary of a temple being a protected area, is there any local response in this period, or did that evolve much later?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. Where does the idea of sanctuary, in the sense of if you're in a religious place, a place of sacrifice in the ancient world, a religious place is really a place of sacrifice. And certainly within Judaism, there is a very strong ethos that the temple should be a place which is beyond ordinary political authority. So that if you go there, basically you're under the protection of the God of that sanctuary. But actually extending that and making it a fact of life as well as a theory means that you have to be able to protect that temple. That's exactly what the revolutionaries did in Jerusalem in the run-up to the revolt against the Romans. They, in the temple of Jerusalem, let's go to the period of Herod the Great, when this was really set up. because Herod really makes the temple, right? And one of the things he does is he establishes a Roman fort called the Antonia right next to the temple, and he connects them with the colonnade. Why? It's a way of saying we exist with Roman protection and support and permission, because we are what's called a religio licita. We are a legal religion. The Romans accept that, which means that Jews cannot be forced to worship Roman gods with sacrifice, whether it's the emperor's image or anyone else's. It's a remarkable constitutional settlement. When the revolutionaries decided, in fact, we're not accepting Rome's sacrifice, and we are going to liberate ourselves from Rome, one of the first things they do is destroy that colonnade between the Antonia fortress and the temple. They cut it off, and they attempt to make the temple into a fortress. It didn't work, although the siege lasted 3 years. This was not a minimal effort by any stretch of the imagination. When the Romans typically went to battle against anyone, let's leave Jerusalem aside for the moment, against any group. And remember, this is in a period before you really had the idea of a single nation. These were cities. So you fought city by city by city by city. And most cities in the ancient world had their own gods, right? They had their own population of deities whom they worshiped, and they were seen as being the protectors of the city. So when the Romans would besiege a city, they would engage in a process that was called the evocatio deorum, the evocation of the gods. They would say, gods of Iconium, come out, leave. Let's make this safe for you so that we don't have to go to war with you. Because if you don't, we're going to have to destroy you. Typically, people would hold out, or at least enough people would hold out that war became necessary. And so the Romans would go in, and they would pillage that temple. So no sanctuary there if they won. They would take the statues from that temple and bring them back to Rome. And the idea was, we've got your gods. They put this in a separate temple in Rome, which was called, wait for it, the Temple of Peace. You know, it's like if you go to Westminster Abbey, you will see all the markers of this campaign and that campaign. And Westminster Abbey is a kind of shrine of empire. You know, I know it's really unfashionable, and the British don't like to be told this, but Westminster Abbey is a shrine of empire. And it's a kind of imitation of the Roman Temple of Peace. That's where the Romans brought the implements of the temple. That's where they were deposited.
And that's why the menorah, et cetera, was depicted on the architrave.
Exactly.
This is marching out with the state.
It is the equivalent of the evocatio deorum. We've evoked your gods, and it's not good. Now your temple is empty. You know, their position would be, we didn't, you know, everybody occupying the army, sorry, we didn't mean to do it to you. This was only a special operation that I was doing. Yeah, so, you know, you have this pretense of really not going to war, but you're really going to war. And you're really not recognizing sanctuary. You try to find a way to say you are, but in fact you are not.
Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. I don't know
Arlene has a
whether there
question
are
for you.
any
Arlene has a
questions.
question for you.
Okay, sure. Please go right ahead.
I have to keep up the tradition.
Yeah, thank you, Arlene. I would be worrying otherwise.
No, Bereniké was a powerful woman in her own right. Did her power influence the other Jewish women in her community and in the communities around? And if so, how so?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Bereniké, is clearly a powerful woman. Does that influence other women within Judaism? And here, I think I would like to talk about the reverse causality. That is that Bereniké is using some of the means of power that we can also see other less prominent Jewish women using at the same time. And I'll give some examples of this. I mentioned the Nazirite vow. The Nazirite vow was, I can put it this way, a great equalizer, in that women could engage in it as well as men. One of the few cases where they could have a kind of access to the temple in Jerusalem in association with sacrifice that equated with that of males. And we have another example of a woman doing this, namely Queen Helena of Adiabene, who in fact engaged in the Nazirite vow even more lavishly than Bereniké did, by not only offering herself, but by underwriting the Nazirite vows of other people. This becomes a highly visible way of taking part of the sacrificial worship in Jerusalem in a way that puts one at the same level as men. I think another way in which she shows the kind of influence a woman can have is precisely through the medium which also resulted in her bad reputation, namely marriage. Namely, marriage alliance permits her to influence Roman policy towards Jerusalem and ultimately Roman policy throughout the empire. There's a major area in which we have very, very good evidence of Jewish women having influence that Bereniké does not share. And this is why I suggest that it's more she who's influenced by them than they who are influenced by her. And that is that women are very prominent in this period for the activity of anointing, on the assumption that anointing is, from which the term, by the way, Christos comes, right? As it turns out today in many churches throughout the world, the gospel was a story of Jesus being anointed by a woman. That's not odd, because women are known for their practice of anointing within the ancient period, not only in Judaism, but also in Judaism. And this is often associated with healing and particular designation. This is an area where Bereniké does not show up, historically speaking, as far as we can see, with any particular agency. So I would suggest that she adapts several instruments of feminine agency, but not all of them during the period. And what it shows us is that even in a culture of misogyny, feminine agency becomes possible. But of course, she has a particular set of opportunities which she has to deal with in exactly the right way in order to make her progress as she did. But nice question. Thank you very much. Arlene, you do not disappoint. It's very good.
I think that may be everything then. That may be,
It may be, yeah, and I see the time is just at 2, so it might be about right, yeah.
maybe a wrap. Pastor Luis, do you want to come and say any final words?
Oh,
Here he comes. He's heading towards the monitor.
Just a word of gratitude to all who are here present and made these conversations invigorating. Dr. Chilton for his dedication, his rigorous scholarship, making it all accessible to all of us. And all of you who have faithfully tuned in to view us, and the Jewish Federation for their wonderful partnership. Tune into their website if you want to know more of their upcoming cultural and educational events. And that's it for now, till the fall. Keep safe and strong, and a happy Passover, happy Easter, whatever you celebrate. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, everybody. Have a blessed week. Bye.
That was